China warning it is not afraid of a trade war with the U.S. after President Trump announced plans to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese imports and new export controls on critical software. However, the president also then softened his tone over the weekend, saying everything with China will be fine.
Canada's foreign affairs minister will travel to China in a matter of weeks in a move that could signal an easing of tensions between the two countries, locked in a diplomatic standoff.
A handshake with the second most powerful man in China, Premier Li Qiang.
Those discussions will deepen. I will expect at the appropriate time to be meeting with President Xi Jinping.
Canada has made a move that few thought possible. For decades, it stood as America's closest ally, bound by trust, trade, and shared values. Yet now that bond has been shaken. In a stunning twist, Canada publicly turned against Washington and threw its support behind China. The decision sent shockwaves through world capitals, leaving even seasoned diplomats speechless. What could drive a partner so deeply connected to the United States to side with its greatest rival? And what does this mean for the future of North America's alliance and global power balance? Let's break it down. It began with a move that few expected. When the Trump administration announced a sweeping 100% tariff on Canadian imports, covering everything from steel and aluminum to cars and lumber, the shock in Ottawa was immediate. The United States had always been more than a trade partner. It was Canada's closest ally, its largest customer, and the foundation of its economy. But this time, the message from Washington was clear: America first, no exceptions. Faced with that reality, Canada was forced into a difficult decision. Either accept Washington's economic pressure or take a bold leap toward independence. That decision was made quietly, behind closed doors, under a level of secrecy rarely seen in Canadian diplomacy. Within days of the tariffs being signed into law, a small Canadian delegation boarded a government jet to Beijing. Publicly, the trip was described as a discussion on energy cooperation. In truth, it marked the beginning of a shift that would redraw political and economic lines across the Northern Hemisphere. Reports later revealed that China had prepared an offer too substantial to ignore. Beijing proposed a sweeping strategic partnership: long-term purchases of Canadian gas, uranium, and agricultural products, combined with massive investments in infrastructure and energy development. In return, Canada would gain full access to Asian markets, a promise that could counterbalance the pain inflicted by US tariffs. For Prime Minister Mark Carney, who had long tried to balance relations between the two superpowers, this was the moment of decision. In a nationally televised address, Carney spoke of protecting the livelihoods of Canadian workers and defending national sovereignty. His words drew thunderous applause in Parliament, while the reaction in Washington was one of fury. Within hours, Donald Trump took to social media, accusing Canada of exploiting the United States and promising consequences. But for the first time in its modern history, Canada didn't yield. It was no longer operating as America's junior partner, but as an independent power charting its own course. International observers immediately grasped the magnitude of this change. The Economist described the move as a form of economic separatism, while the Financial Times called it a quiet revolution in the North. The most dramatic moment came soon after, when Canada's foreign minister publicly stated that Ottawa understood and supported China's countermeasures against US tariffs. The statement was a diplomatic earthquake. Behind that bold declaration was a clear calculation. China had been searching for reliable partners to secure critical resources amid escalating tensions with Washington. Canada, with its abundance of oil, gas, uranium, nickel, and rare earth elements, fit perfectly into Beijing's strategic needs. In exchange, China promised investments in Canadian infrastructure, the construction of new Pacific ports, and low-interest credit lines through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The response in Washington was one of disbelief. US officials scrambled to re-establish communication, but their calls went unanswered. According to senior sources quoted by the Wall Street Journal, American diplomats felt blindsided. One official admitted, "We always thought of Canada as part of us. Now it feels like it's no longer with us." For Trump, the fallout was personal. During his presidency, he often claimed to love Canada but complained bitterly about trade imbalances. Now his policies had done what no foreign adversary could: push America's closest neighbor toward China. The consequences rippled across markets almost instantly. The Canadian dollar surged. Chinese stock indexes rose. Meanwhile, US markets dipped amid fears of instability in North American trade. Major Canadian corporations quickly began adapting to the new reality. Energy giants like Suncor and Barrick Gold opened talks with Chinese partners to establish joint ventures. The shift in alliances was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time. In Washington, congressional anger was growing. Senator Marco Rubio labeled Canada's actions a betrayal of the continent, while former White House advisor Steve Bannon warned that Trump had unleashed forces he could no longer control. Television networks fanned the flames. Fox News accused Carney of selling out to Beijing, while pundits on talk shows spoke of a new front in an economic Cold War. Yet in Canada, the mood was different. Political analysts called it an act of self-preservation rather than treachery. As economist James Brown from the University of Calgary explained, Canada was tired of having its economic future dictated by shifts in the White House. This isn't betrayal, he said, it's maturity. China, meanwhile, celebrated the diplomatic victory. The Global Times declared that America tried to isolate China but ended up isolating itself. On Chinese social media, the phrase "northern partner" went viral, gathering hundreds of millions of views. To many in China, Canada's decision symbolized a broader global realignment, proof that US influence was no longer unshakable. The shockwaves reached beyond trade. Within NATO, anxiety spread quickly. Although Canada remained a formal member, European officials began to question its reliability. According to The Guardian, Brussels discussed whether to restrict Canada's access to classified NATO materials, fearing sensitive information could reach Beijing through its new partnerships. Still, in financial circles, optimism was growing. The Financial Post described Canada's evolving role as a bridge between East and West, yet behind that optimistic framing lay a deeper strategic concern. For decades, the United States had relied on Canadian oil, gas, and minerals to sustain its industries. If those resources began flowing toward Asia instead, the balance of power across North America would shift dramatically. Confidential reports leaked to Bloomberg Intelligence revealed that Beijing had offered Ottawa a deal worth more than $200 billion for long-term natural gas supplies. For Canada, this represented an economic lifeline at a time when American tariffs were suffocating its industries. For the United States, it was a strategic defeat. In Washington's corridors of power, the phrase "loss of influence in our own backyard" began circulating among frustrated lawmakers. Analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations summarized the situation bluntly. Canada, cornered by tariffs, had chosen realism. In a world increasingly divided by power blocs, it made more sense to partner with those offering trade rather than punishment. Inside the White House, the mood turned grim. According to CNN, emergency meetings were convened with senior military and economic advisors. One official was quoted saying, "We've lost the northern flank." Pentagon analysts even began using a new term in their internal briefings: continental economic vulnerability. While Washington scrambled to respond, Canada was celebrating what it saw as a new beginning. Newspapers ran headlines about national pride and independence. Business leaders praised the government's courage in standing up for domestic industries. For many citizens, it felt like a defining moment, a chance to break free from decades of quiet dependence on American goodwill. Yet behind the excitement, the risks were enormous. Canada had effectively placed itself between two global giants locked in an escalating rivalry. Every move from this point forward would be scrutinized by both Washington and Beijing. As The Economist observed, China and Canada may be vastly different civilizations, but they now shared one pressing goal: survival under pressure from the United States. Ironically, it was Trump's attempt to make America stronger that pushed its oldest neighbor into the arms of its biggest rival. For over 150 years, the border between the two nations had symbolized partnership and shared destiny. Now it was becoming the front line of an economic and geopolitical divide that could reshape the future of the continent. Around the world, governments and markets watched the unfolding events with growing unease. America's reputation as the unchallenged leader of the Western world, was weakening. China, on the other hand, was expanding its reach in ways once considered unthinkable. And Canada, a country long viewed as quiet and predictable, was suddenly emerging as a central player in a global power struggle. This was no longer a simple trade dispute or diplomatic disagreement. It represented a deeper transformation in the structure of global power. According to a confidential IMF report cited by Bloomberg, if Canada and China succeeded in linking their energy and industrial supply chains, North America could face the most significant economic reorganization since World War II. For decades, the United States had dictated the rules of that order. Now, those rules were being rewritten. And in a turn no one could have predicted, it was America's closest neighbor that decided it was time to play by its own. Moreover, in other major developments, high-level trade talks between Canada and the United States are underway in Washington, D.C., as both sides try to break through rising economic tensions. The discussions, led by Canada's Minister of Trade, Dominic LeBlanc, and top officials, including Privy Council clerk Michael Sabia, are centered on reaching new agreements in the steel, aluminum, and energy sectors. Industries that have become flashpoints in the strained relationship between Ottawa and Washington. According to LeBlanc's office, these meetings are part of ongoing efforts to restore stability in North American trade after months of economic friction. Following Prime Minister Mark Carney's recent trip to Washington, the minister described the talks as positive and substantive, signaling that both countries are at least open to compromise. Yet, beneath the diplomatic language lies a growing sense of urgency. The negotiations are taking place as pressure builds at home, where provincial leaders and local officials are urging Ottawa to take a tougher stand against US President Donald Trump's aggressive trade policies. LeBlanc revealed that the recent discussions concluded with Trump instructing his Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, and US Trade Representative Jameson Greer to continue working with their Canadian counterparts. Both sides are reportedly exploring ways to reach rapid agreements that could stabilize the affected sectors and potentially open the door for broader economic cooperation. For Canada, securing these deals quickly is critical, as the impact of US tariffs continues to ripple through key industries and threaten thousands of jobs. Those tariffs have already reshaped the North American auto industry. To force more vehicle production back into the United States, Trump imposed a 25% tariff on cars and light trucks imported from Canada, exempting only the value of components made with American parts. The move immediately shifted the corporate calculus for automakers operating on both sides of the border. Earlier this week, Stellantis, the company formerly known as Chrysler, announced it would invest $13 billion over the next 4 years to expand its production network in Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana. The plan includes the creation of more than 5,000 American jobs and a major relocation of Jeep production from the Brampton assembly plant in Ontario to the Belvidere facility in Illinois. Although Stellantis insists it will maintain operations in Brampton, the decision sparked outrage among Canadian leaders who had provided billions in incentives to keep manufacturing within the country. In 2023, Ottawa and the Ontario government agreed to offer Stellantis LG Energy Solutions up to $15 billion in performance incentives tied to battery production. The company, in return, pledged to uphold its commitments in Canada, including keeping its Brampton facility active. Now, with that plant sitting idle, frustration is mounting. Speaking from New Brunswick, Industry Minister Melanie Joly called the move completely unacceptable. She reminded reporters that the government had directly supported the retooling of the Brampton plant, saying officials would hold Stellantis accountable for its promises. Prime Minister Carney shared her frustration, describing the shift as a direct consequence of US tariff policy. He emphasized that his government was already working with Stellantis to identify new opportunities in the Brampton area, while making it clear that Canada expected the automaker to honor its commitments to Canadian workers.